There is a photograph taken sometime in the 1870s that has passed through the hands of antique dealers, estate sales, and archivists for generations. At first glance, it shows nothing unusual. A mother seated beside a small child, both dressed in their finest dark wool, a painted garden backdrop behind them, a fern placed carefully to the left of the frame. The mother stares into the lens with the practiced stillness that Victorian portraiture demanded. The child does not move, and that, if you look closely enough, is the first thing that should make you stop. Children rarely held still in the 19th century, yet this child is perfectly, unnervingly motionless, no blur at the fingertips, no soft edge around the ears. The child's eyes are open, fixed on a point just past the camera, and the position of the small hands, folded neatly, resting on the lap, looks less like a pose and more like an arrangement. Look again at the mother's left arm. Notice where it falls behind the child's back, not resting, but supporting. And now, if you have not already, notice the faint metal stand just barely visible beneath the hem of the child's dress, partially hidden by the photographer's careful staging. This child had already died before the photograph was taken, and the mother wanted one last portrait. Keep watching, because nearly every photograph from this period has a secret, if you know where to look. In the earliest decades of photography, the act of being photographed was not casual. It was not spontaneous. It was, for many families, the single most significant visual record their lives would ever produce. Photography arrived in force during the 1840s with the daguerreotype, a process that fixed an image onto a silver-coated copper plate with startling clarity. By the 1850s and 1860s, the tintype had made portraiture affordable for working-class families, and by the latter decades of the century, the cabinet card, a large album in print mounted on stiff cardboard, had become the dominant form of studio portraiture. Historians note that for many ordinary families, a cabinet card portrait was among the most expensive objects they owned. It was displayed on parlor shelves and mantelpieces. It was sent to relatives overseas. It was placed inside lockets and pressed between the pages of Bibles. This is why people were so still. The early photographic processes required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds, sometimes much longer in poor light. The slightest movement blurred the image, producing what later viewers would sometimes mistake for ghostly apparitions or mysterious smears. Records from the period show that photographers employed various tools to help their subjects remain motionless: rigid posing chairs with high backs, armrests designed to lock the elbows in place, and, most strikingly, hidden metal stands called posing stands or head clamps, which braced the back of the skull and held the neck rigid during the exposure. These stands appear in the backgrounds of dozens of surviving photographs, half hidden by skirts, by shadows, by the edge of a drape. Pause here and look carefully the next time you examine an old portrait. Search behind the subject's legs, beneath a chair, along the edge of a dark curtain. The stand is often there, a small iron ghost no one thought to mention. Look closely at the corner of the frame in almost any Victorian studio portrait, and you will begin to find things the photographer never intended you to notice. The painted backdrops, elaborate scenes of classical columns, woodland paths, balustrades overlooking imaginary gardens, occasionally show their seams, their wrinkles, their patches where the canvas has been repaired with a slightly different shade of paint. These backdrops were rented props, used for hundreds of different clients across years and decades, and studio photographs from the same city and the same decade often share the same trees, the same stone balustrade, the same improbable Mediterranean sky. A family in a modest tenement apartment and a family of merchants could stand before the same painted horizon. Photography democratized aspiration before it could fully record reality, and yet, for all the effort to project dignity and prosperity, these photographs contain evidence of their own secrets. Notice the shoes. Historians studying Victorian portraiture have observed that subjects often wore their best clothing above the waist: fine collars, carefully pressed jackets, jet mourning brooches, while their shoes remained plain, cracked, or unpolished, visible just beneath the hem. The camera was expected to capture the face. The floor was an afterthought. In this way, a single photograph sometimes tells two stories at once: the story the family wished to present and the story the frame accidentally preserved. There is a category of 19th century photography that remains even now genuinely difficult to look at without pausing. It is called post-mortem photography, and it was a widespread and accepted practice across Europe and North America throughout much of the Victorian period. The death rate among children was extraordinarily high. Historians estimate that in mid-19th century cities, a significant portion of children did not survive past the age of 5, lost to cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. For families who could not afford multiple portraits during a child's brief life, the post-mortem photograph was sometimes the only likeness they would ever have. Photographers developed specific techniques for these sessions. The deceased were dressed in their finest clothing, posed in chairs or laid in their beds, sometimes with flowers placed in their hands, sometimes with their eyes propped gently open, or lids painted to appear so in the final developed image. Surviving siblings were posed beside them. Parents stood directly behind, hands resting on shoulders, faces carefully composed. Tell us what detail you noticed first. The stillness, or the flowers, or the way one figure's posture differs so slightly from all the others in the frame. The signs are subtle once you know where to look. A child positioned with greater care than the rest, a complexion that appears unnaturally pale, even accounting for the silver tones of early photography, a posture too perfect, limbs arranged rather than seated. Historians who have studied collections of Victorian mourning photography note that grieving families did not consider these portraits morbid. They were cherished. They were an act of love and of documentation. The dead deserved to be remembered with the same dignity as the living, and if photography was the most accurate record the age possessed, then photography would be made to preserve them. Keep watching, because it is not only the dead who left traces in these images. Long exposure times created another category of hidden figure entirely: the living who moved. In photographs made outdoors or in busy streets, the cityscapes documented by early photographers in London, Paris, and New York, the exposure times were long enough that pedestrians walking through the frame simply vanished, their bodies too brief and too blurred to register fully on the plate. Occasionally, however, a figure who paused for even a moment left behind a translucent shape, a smear of suggestion, a half-formed person frozen in the act of crossing a street or turning a corner. Early viewers sometimes described these as spirits. In reality, they were simply people moving through a world that the camera had not yet learned to catch. The technology revealed a strange and melancholy truth. To be seen by the camera, you had to hold perfectly still. Movement was erasure. Double exposure, the accidental or deliberate re-exposure of the same photographic plate, produced stranger effects still. A landscape might develop with a face faintly visible within the trees. A portrait might contain the ghost of a previous session, another subject barely present behind the sitter's shoulder. It is believed that some photographers exploited this technique deliberately during the 1860s and 1870s, claiming to capture the spirits of the departed hovering near the living. Records from the period show that so-called spirit photography became a genuine commercial enterprise, attracting both devoted believers and fierce skeptics, and that some grieving families paid considerable sums for portraits that appeared to show their dead standing close beside them. The technique required nothing supernatural. It required only a dark room, an unscrupuled hand, and a willingness to expose a plate twice. Notice the hand behind the curtain in a studio portrait. Notice the painted seam in the backdrop where the sky meets the column and the colors do not quite match. Notice the posing stand beneath the dress, and the shoes worn down at the heel, and the mourning brooch at the throat, and the jet bracelet at the wrist, and the way the eyes of one figure in a family portrait seem aimed at something no longer present in the room. These photographs were made in candlelit studios and in parlors draped in grief. They were made by men and women who understood, as their subjects understood, that the image would outlast everyone standing before the lens. They were made with the quiet knowledge that a photograph was not merely a picture. It was a document. It was evidence. It was the closest thing the 19th century possessed to permanence. And permanence, it turns out, preserves everything: the dignity the family wished to project, and the poverty they could not quite conceal, and the grief too vast for any pose to contain, and the shadow falling at the wrong angle from a source no one thought to move, and the hand that should not be visible behind the chair, and the child who did not blink because the child could not blink, and the mother who held everything together for the length of one exposure, and then, when the photographer finally said it was done, let herself look away. Old photographs do not only preserve faces, they preserve secrets. And the longer you look, the more those secrets look back.